The snow had been falling for 2 days straight. I sat in the hospital waiting room watching it pile up against the windows, slow and indifferent, the way grief collects before you realize it's buried you. My daughter lay in the trauma unit 4 floors above, her spine fractured in 3 places, her left leg shattered so badly the surgeon had used the word reconstruct like it was something ordinary. The man who ran the red light walked away. My daughter did not walk at all, not yet, and the doctors weren't sure she ever would without intervention. They cost more money than I had seen in my 63 years of living. I had retired from the public library system the previous spring. My pension was modest, the way pensions for people who loved books more than money tend to be. My savings account held enough for a used car and a modest vacation, not enough for the surgeries my daughter needed, not for the rehabilitation that would follow, not for the home modifications not would follow, not for the home modifications, not for any of it. The number the billing coordinator had shown me sat behind my eyes like a bruise, $418,000. My daughter was 38. She had a 7-year-old son named Theo who was staying with my neighbor while I waited in this room. She was supposed to go back to teaching second grade in 3 weeks. She had been driving to pick up her son's birthday cake when the other car came through without stopping. Mrs. Beaumont. A man in a charcoal suit appeared beside me. He was somewhere in his 50s, silver-haired, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost what I made in a month. I looked up from my hands. I'm the attorney for a man named Thomas Reinholt. He's been made aware of your daughter's situation and he'd like to help. I didn't know the name. I said so. He develops property along the northeastern coast. He's been doing it for 40 years. He's very well known in certain circles. Help how? I asked, the way a drowning person asks which direction is shore. The attorney sat down beside me. He set his briefcase on his knees and folded his hands over it. Mr. Reinhold is ill. Seriously ill. His doctors have given him somewhere between 4 and 8 months. He has spent his life building things, the attorney said, and he is going to die alone in a house full of beautiful rooms that nobody uses. He would like company for whatever time he has left. Genuine company. Someone to share meals with, to talk to simply be present. I stared at him. He is proposing marriage, the attorney said quietly. In exchange, he will cover every expense related to your daughter's care. All of it. Surgery, rehabilitation, in-home care, whatever she needs for as long as she needs it. I laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp for that soft waiting room. I apologized immediately, though I wasn't sure why. I know how it sounds, the attorney said. He doesn't expect you to pretend it's something it isn't. He's a practical man asking for a practical arrangement. When he passes, you will be free. You will also be provided for generously. I thought about my daughter upstairs. I thought about Theo asking me that morning when his mommy was coming home. I thought about the billing coordinator's careful, neutral face. You have until tomorrow, the attorney said. That night, I sat beside my daughter's bed and held her hand and told her I was going to fix it. She was barely conscious, floating somewhere between the pain and the medication. She squeezed my fingers without opening her eyes, and I took that as permission for the thing I had already decided to do. The wedding happened in the attorney's office on a Wednesday afternoon in February. There were no flowers. There was no music. The witnesses were the attorney and a woman named Agnes, who was introduced to me as Thomas's housekeeper of 25 years. Agnes was in her 70s with white hair pulled back neatly and eyes that had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by most of it. She smiled at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite hope, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Thomas sat in a wheelchair beside the attorney's desk. I hadn't expected that. The attorney had said heart condition, had said the deterioration was advanced. I had imagined someone who moved slowly, who tired easily. I had not imagined a man in a wheelchair who looked like he had aged a decade past his 67 years. His face was the color of January. His hands, when he signed the marriage certificate, shook with a fine, continuous tremor. But his eyes, when he finally looked at me directly, with the sharpest thing in the room, Thank you, he said. His voice was rough at the edges, like gravel in low water. I know what you're giving up to do this. I'm not giving up anything, I said. I'm getting my daughter back. Something moved across his face. He nodded once, slowly, like that was the answer he had expected, and it satisfied him. Agnes drove us to the estate in a Volvo that smelled like lavender and good leather. The house appeared through bare maple trees after a long private road, and my first thought was that it was the most solitary looking, beautiful thing I had ever seen. Gray shingle siding, white trim, 4 chimneys, a wraparound porch facing a view of the Maine coast that, even in February, even under 2 feet of snow, made me stop breathing for a moment. The inside was warm but spare. Everything was expensive and nothing was comfortable in the way that tells you a house has never been lived and the way houses are meant to be lived in. Good rugs, good art, beautiful cold rooms. Your room is upstairs, Thomas said. He was already wheeling himself toward the far end of the ground floor hallway. I don't use the second floor anymore. The stairs are too much. Mrs. Hartley. He stopped and corrected himself. Agnes. Agnes will show you around and get you whatever you need. He disappeared around a corner without looking back. Agnes touched my elbow. Come, she said. I'll make you something warm. The kitchen was the only room in the house that felt inhabited. It smelled like coffee and something baking, and the table in the center was worn smooth at the edges in a way that meant people had actually sat there for years. Agnes moved through it with the ease of someone who had made 1,000 meals in that exact space. How long has he been this sick? I asked. She set a mug in front of me. About 6 months now. The doctor said it was cardiomyopathy, that the heart muscle had deteriorated to the point that it simply couldn't sustain much longer. She paused. He was never a man who asked for help. Not once in 25 years. So for him to do this, to ask a stranger into his home, she looked at me steadily. He must be lonelier than I realized. I thought about that later. Lying in a beautiful room with good linens listening to the wind come off the water. I thought about what it cost a man like that to admit he didn't want to die alone. The first 2 weeks I barely saw him. He worked in his study most of the day, taking calls, reviewing documents, conducting business with the focused intensity of a man who had decided to keep moving until he couldn't. We ate dinner at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 12, exchanging polite sentences about the weather, about whether Agnes's pot roast was better than last time, about nothing that mattered. I visited my daughter every day. She had come through the first surgery. She was awake, pale, beginning the long work of learning to be patient with her own body. Is he kind to you? She asked. He's quiet, I said. Mom, I'm fine. You concentrate on getting better. But something was bothering me even then. Something I couldn't quite name. Thomas was declining faster than 6 months into the prognosis should have produced. He looked worse at the end of each week than he had at the beginning. The coughing at night had started in my second week there, dry and deep and lasting too long. Twice I heard something fall in the room below mine. He refuses every appointment, Agnes told me when I brought it up. His physician calls, his cardiologist calls. He cancels them. He says there's no point. Has he always been like that about doctors? She thought about it. No, she said slowly. Not always. Before he got sick, he had his annual checkups like clockwork. He was careful about his health. This resistance is newer. Then came the night everything changed between us. I couldn't sleep. The wind was particularly loud, and I had been lying awake thinking about Theo, about whether my daughter would ever run again, about the particular loneliness of being 63 in a stranger's house in February. I went downstairs for tea. I heard it from the hallway. A crash, then a low sound of effort, someone straining. I pushed open the study door and found Thomas on the floor beside his desk. The wheelchair had tipped sideways. He had clearly been trying to reach something on the desk and had leaned too far. He was attempting to right himself with what remained of his strength, which was not much. Don't, I said. You'll hurt yourself. Let me. I don't need. Thomas. He stopped. He looked at me with those sharp eyes. Then something in his shoulders let go. It took effort to get him upright and back into the chair. He was heavier than his diminished frame suggested, still a large man in the bones, and he gripped the armrests while I positioned the wheelchair and helped him settle. By the time we were done, his face was covered in a thin sweat and he was breathing in the careful way of someone managing pain. I need the bottle in the top right drawer, he said. The white one. I found it and gave it to him. He took 2 tablets with the glass of water from his desk and sat quietly until his breathing evened out. Why won't you see your doctors? I asked. I sat down in the chair across from him. I wasn't going anywhere. He looked out the dark window for a long moment. Because they tell me the same thing every time, he said, that the damage is progressing, that there's nothing they can do except manage the remaining time. I would rather not spend the remaining time being managed. I understand that, I said, but you're getting worse faster than they predicted. Have you told them that? He turned to look at me. You've noticed. I notice things. I was a librarian for 31 years. We are professionally obligated to notice things. Something shifted in his expression. A door opening a fraction of an inch. A month, he said quietly. Maybe 6 weeks. I don't think it will be longer than that. I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. This was a business arrangement. This man was a stranger. And yet, let me help you to bed, I said. After that night, we began to find each other. He started appearing in the kitchen in the mornings before Agnes arrived. I would be there with my coffee and my book, and he would wheel himself to the end of the table, and Agnes would have left things for his breakfast that he can manage himself, and we would sit in the quiet of early morning without needing to fill it. He told me about his wife, Elena, who had died 11 years ago from cancer at 54. About how he had kept working after because work was the only language he knew for surviving grief. About the houses he had built along this coastline and the satisfaction of making things that lasted. About his nephew Daniel, who now managed the estate finances, who had been with him since Elena died, who was, he said with a tone I couldn't quite read, very efficient. I told him about my late husband who had passed 8 years ago and who had been the funniest man I ever knew. About my daughter, who had her father's stubbornness and her grandmother's laugh. About 31 years of watching children discover books for the first time, which never got old, no matter how many times you saw it. About how I had planned to travel after retiring, all the places I bookmarked and all the travel books I cataloged over the decades. You should still go, he said. Maybe I will, I said. You will, he said. Promise me you'll go. I'm not promising you anything until you promise me you'll call your cardiologist. He laughed at that. It was the first time I heard him laugh. It was a good sound, a little rusty with disuse, but genuine. Fair enough, he said. My daughter was improving steadily. The second surgery had gone well. She was beginning physical therapy, which was brutal and necessary. Her son visited on weekends and would climb carefully into her hospital bed and tell her everything that had happened at school with the thorough reporting of a 7-year-old who understands that his mother has missed things she needs to be caught up on. Thomas asked about her every morning. He remembered the details. Her son's name, her school, the specific vertebra that had given the surgeon the most trouble. He listened the way people listen when they actually want to know. How is he treating you? My daughter asked during one of my visits. And this time, when I'd paused before answering, she looked at me with her father's eyes. Mom, it's complicated, I said. She reached over and took my hand. It doesn't have to be. By the end of my second month in the house, Thomas and I had settled into a life together that I hadn't planned and couldn't quite explain. Evening reading in the sitting room, him with his architectural journals and me with whatever novel Agnes had recommended. Slow walks, on the days when the weather permitted and he had enough energy, me beside the chair, both of us looking at the water. long dinners that had migrated from the formal table to the kitchen where the conversation was easier, and Agnes would occasionally join us with her own cup of tea and her opinions about everything. But he was still getting worse. The good days were becoming less frequent. The coughing fits were longer. Some mornings he couldn't leave his room at all. I was more than bothered. I was frightened, and I had begun to pay attention the way you pay attention when something feels wrong, but you can't yet say why. It started with the pills. I found him in his bathroom one morning, a row of prescription bottles lined up on the counter, trying to remember which ones he had already taken. I helped him sort through them. There were 7 bottles. Different physicians, different pharmacies, different dates. A man with his resources, with access to the best medical care in the country, was managing 7 separate, uncoordinated prescriptions like someone without a primary physician. These aren't all from the same doctor, I said. He shrugged. Daniel coordinates with the various specialists. Do they communicate with each other? The specialists? I assume so. He didn't know. He had been trusting Daniel to manage it. I looked at the bottles, at the dosages. Something was off in a way I couldn't quantify standing there in a bathroom, but it sat in the back of my mind for the rest of the day. I started noticing other things. Daniel came to the house every morning around 9. He was 41, compact and efficient and always moving, always carrying folders or a phone or both. He would bring Thomas a small tray, coffee, a glass of water, what he called a vitamin regimen in a little divided container, several capsules and tablets. Thomas took them without looking, the way you take things from people you have trusted for a decade. Within an hour of taking them, Thomas was always tired, always slower. I told myself that was an illness, but I kept watching. Daniel scheduled Thomas's medical appointments and then called to cancel them. I had assumed Thomas is directing this, refusing to go. But one afternoon, I was in the hallway outside the study and I heard Daniel on the phone, heard him say the appointment wasn't necessary, that Mr. Reinholt was resting, that they would reschedule, in a tone that suggested reschedule was a word meaning never. I went back to the library, which is what I always did when something required careful thought. What I thought about was this: Thomas Reinholt's will, which I had no right to read and had not read, but which Daniel had mentioned once in passing in the way people mention things they think about often. The estate would require capable management after Thomas was gone, Daniel had said. He was prepared for that responsibility. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I waited until Thomas had taken his morning regimen and gone back to his room. I waited until Agnes left for groceries. Then I took the vitamin container Daniel had left and drove to the pharmacy in town. The pharmacist was a man named Robert, somewhere in his 60s, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had long ago made peace with his small corner of the world. I told him I was concerned about a family member's supplement regimen. I showed him what was in the container. He looked at the tablets for a long time without speaking. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "A family member," I repeated. He looked up at me. "These aren't supplements. This one here is a calcium channel blocker, a strong one. And this," he picked up another, "this is a diuretic." He set them down carefully. "Do you know what calcium channel blockers do in someone with a cardiomyopathy diagnosis?" I shook my head. "They slow the heart. They drop blood pressure. In someone with an already compromised cardiac system, taking these daily at this dosage over a period of months," he met my eyes, "it would look exactly like a heart condition getting worse. Fatigue, weakness, reduced function, the heart genuinely deteriorating. Would it kill them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Over time, yes. Probably." I drove back to the house in a state of cold clarity that I recognized from only a handful of moments in my life. The same clarity I had felt the morning I knew my husband was gone. The same clarity I had felt in the hospital billing office. Times when the situation is very bad and very clear and there is only one thing to do next. Agnes was back from groceries. I found her in the kitchen and I sat down across from her and I told her everything. Everything I had noticed, everything the pharmacist had said. She sat very still while I talked. When I finished, her face was the color of the snow outside. "Daniel," she said. The word came out like she was testing whether it could possibly be true. "He handles all of Thomas's medical coordination. He cancels the doctor appointments. He brings those capsules every morning and Thomas takes them without question." Agnes pressed both hands flat on the table. "He has been like a son to that man since Elena died." "I know, the inheritance, yes." She stood up slowly. "Call 911, she said. "Right now." The police came. The paramedics came. Thomas was confused by the disruption and resisted until I knelt down beside his chair and told him quietly that I needed him to trust me the same way I had trusted him when I walked into this house in February. And he looked at me for a long moment and then he nodded. At the hospital, they ran every test available: blood work, cardiac imaging, a full toxicological panel. The cardiologist came out to speak to me and Agnes in the waiting room with the expression of a man who has found something he wishes he hadn't. "There is evidence of systematic medication interference," he said. "Someone has been administering pharmaceutical agents in dosages that would cause significant cardiac stress over time. Your husband does not have advanced cardiomyopathy. He has a moderate arrhythmia, manageable with appropriate medication, and cardiac damage consistent with approximately 6 months of the substances we found in his system." He paused. "He should have been feeling better, not worse. Everything he has been experiencing, the weakness, the fatigue, the rate of decline was being caused. He was being poisoned," I said. The doctor did not look away. "Yes." Daniel Reinholt was located at the estate that evening. The police found correspondence in his home office, communications with a private equity group interested in acquiring Thomas's coastal development portfolio, estimates of the estate's value, a timeline. They found the source of the pharmaceutical agents. They found a copy of Thomas's will with Daniel's name on 30% of it, and they found evidence that Daniel had been quietly contesting the terms with an attorney for 2 months. He had calculated that Thomas had perhaps another few weeks. He had been right. Without intervention, he probably had. Thomas spent 3 weeks in hospital. I came every day. I sat in the chair beside his bed the way I had sat beside my daughter's bed in a different hospital, and I watched the color come back into his face slowly, the way spring comes to Maine, reluctant at first, then suddenly and all at once. The tremor in his hands stopped. He sat straighter. He ate full meals. One morning, I arrived to find him standing at the window with a cane, looking out at the parking structure like it was a view worth having. "You're standing," I said. "I've been practicing when you're not here," he said without turning around. "Didn't want you to see me fall." "Thomas." He turned around then. His face in the morning light looked 10 years younger than the man I had married in February. He looked for the first time like someone who was going to live. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something from a terrible greeting card," he said. "So I'm just going to say it plainly because that's apparently the only way I know how to speak. These months with you have been the first time since Elena died that I have wanted a tomorrow." I looked at him standing there with his cane. This man I had married for the money to save my daughter, and somewhere along the way had begun to care about deeply in ways I had not budgeted for. "When I'm discharged," he said carefully, "if you want to leave, I will make sure you and your daughter are taken care of for the rest of your lives. Everything I promised you and more. You have done more for me than you signed up for, and I owe you that. And if I don't want to leave," his hands tightened on the cane. "Then I would very much like to try to make you happy," he said, "for as long as I can," which the cardiologist assures me could be quite some time with the correct medication, so I feel obligated to be honest with you that you might be signing up for a longer arrangement than originally discussed. I stood up and walked to where he was standing by the window. "I've always liked long books," I said. He put his free hand against my face with a gentleness that was entirely different from anything I had expected from a man who had spent his life building things out of steel and stone. And I thought about my daughter in her hospital bed saying it doesn't have to be complicated. And I thought that she was right, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin in the most desperate places, and sometimes that's exactly the point. Daniel pleaded guilty to charges that took the better part of a year to sort through. The attorneys handled most of it, and Thomas was kept informed but protected from the worst of it by people whose job it was to do exactly that. What Thomas mostly did during that year was recover. He walked without the cane by April. By June, he was driving again. By August, he had hiked a short trail above the coast and stood at the top looking out at the water with the expression of a man who is memorizing something he understands he nearly lost. My daughter came to the estate for her own recovery in the spring. We converted the large guest room on the ground floor and set it up for her needs, and she spent 4 months there with her son, her physical therapist coming 3 times a week. Theo running through the rooms and discovering the beach and attaching himself to Agnes with the thoroughness of a child who recognizes a grandmother figure regardless of biological relationship. My daughter and Thomas had dinner together every night during those months. I would watch them talking across the table and feel something in my chest that was too large for one emotion. He told her about her mother the way I never could have told her myself. The parts he had observed quietly and from the outside, and she listened with her eyes bright. "He's good," she told me one afternoon when we were alone. "He's genuinely good. I know." She looked at me for a moment. "You love him." I thought about February and the snowfall against the hospital window. I thought about a man on the floor of his study at 2 in the morning and a pharmacist who looked up from a set of tablets with something terrible in his eyes. I thought about standing beside a window in a hospital room and saying I've always liked long books. "Yes," I said, "I do." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Good," she said firmly. "You've been a widow for 8 years. I think 8 years is enough." Thomas sold a portion of his development portfolio not because he needed to, but because he decided to. "I had enough," he said simply. "I would rather build something different now." We used a significant portion of the proceeds to establish a foundation providing emergency medical funds to accident victims facing catastrophic expenses, navigating the gap between what insurance covered and what survival actually cost. It was my idea, born in a waiting room in February, and Thomas adopted it with the enthusiasm of a man who had found, late in life, the kind of purpose that the construction of beautiful buildings had never quite satisfied. We hired a director and a small staff. We reviewed applications together every Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, the same table where we had found each other over early coffee and the sound of the water. Sometimes Agnes sat with us and offered opinions that were invariably correct. That first year we helped 11 families, the year after, 23. We got a note once from a woman in Ohio whose father had been in a coma for 6 weeks and whose family had run out of everything trying to keep him alive. We had been able to help. He woke up. He went home. He saw his grandchildren. She wrote to us 3 months after he was discharged to say that he was teaching her daughter to play chess. I read it aloud to Thomas at breakfast and had to stop twice. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "That's what the money was always for," he said. "It just took the right person to figure it out. Last fall, we traveled. Portugal first, because it had been at the top of my list for 30 years, filed under someday, filed under eventually, filed under when life finally clears enough space. Life had cleared the space. We walked through Lisbon on a warm October afternoon, Thomas and I and Agnes, who refused to be left behind and turned out to be an unexpectedly aggressive sightseer. And I stopped in front of a wall covered in hand-painted azulejo tiles and felt the kind of happiness that is quiet and solid and doesn't need to announce itself. I thought about that February waiting room, about the number $418,000, about a man I didn't know offering me an impossible thing in an impossible moment, and me saying yes because I had no other options and nothing left to lose. I thought about how the worst decisions you ever make can become the best ones, not despite the desperation behind them, but sometimes exactly because of it. Because desperation strips away everything that isn't essential and leaves you only with what matters, with the people who matter, with the questions worth asking, and the things worth noticing, and the extraordinary grace of paying close attention to the life you're actually living. My daughter runs now. Not long distances, not yet, but she runs. I watched her chase Theo down the beach in front of the estate last August, and I stood on the porch with my hands around a coffee mug and I couldn't speak for a full minute. Thomas came and stood beside me. He didn't say anything. He just watched with me. Then he took the coffee mug gently from my hands and set it on the railing and put his arms around me from behind the way you hold someone when you understand that what you're holding is everything. The snow comes in February the same way it always has, heavy and slow and indifferent. I watch it through the kitchen window now, and it doesn't look the way it used to look. It doesn't look like the end of something. It looks like the beginning of a quiet morning in a warm house, with coffee on, and Agnes humming somewhere, and a man I love in the next room doing the work of a life we built out of desperation and poison and grace and the stubborn refusal to stop paying attention. It looks like enough. It looks like more than enough. It looks like everything.